Welcome to the March 14th program of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. This is our 32nd year, and I appreciate the loyalty of all of you that came out on this challenging night. If I could have, I'm going to call for people involved in World War II aviation to stand and continue to stand. I know we got some people here, our speakers this evening. Here, let me turn this on. We got a couple here. Any other, I know that Mr. Peterson is there, Ray Peterson. I saw him. Anybody else? Okay, then World War II veterans of other services, please stand. Thank you so much. Program this evening was to be on the intelligence aspects. Our good friend Rob Ellers is on contract with the Defense Department and still does some of that spook stuff that we're not supposed to know about. He got called away and recruited Rich Muller to come up from Maxwell Air Force Base. We've had such great relations with folks from there in the past. I just wish we could have had better weather for you, Rich. But we've kept you busy. But Rich is going to be speaking on his topic of the, turn down the light here, a new look at the Bombing Command and a tribute to the 8th Air Force. Rich, welcome to Minnesota. We hope you come back sometime when the weather's not as foul. Rich Miller, thanks.
I just first would like to say that the views expressed tonight do not necessarily represent those of the Air Force, Air University, or the Department of Defense. I have to say that. I am actually privileged to teach at a school that educates the Air Force's future strategists, and the men and women in our classes are every much the heirs of the World War II generation in terms of their knowledge and patriotism and innovativeness and all that. And it's just a privilege to do that, and to tell you tonight about the bomber offensive in World War II, what it actually contributed to Allied victory in that perhaps greatest of all conflicts. I just have to mention the Harold C. Deutsch World War II Roundtable. When I was I think I was just out of grad school. I was just a brand new PhD, and I was giving one of my very first papers at a conference. And you know, these conferences, historians get up and they read papers and they talk and they get critiqued and all that. And I'm about to start, and I realize in the front row of my panel, which was mostly other new PhDs, young, unknown people, there is Dr. Harold C. Deutsch is sitting there in the front row. He would come to all of the young scholars' panels and help them out. He really was interested in mentoring younger people. A lot of the high rollers in the profession want to hobnob with each other. They don't want to see the young guys. He was always there with the young students, and that always stuck with me. And so it's a privilege to be here at the roundtable, which bears his name. All right, what I'm going to talk about tonight is the Strategic Air Offensive. Now, there were two campaigns in World War II that essentially went from the very first day or weeks of the war to the very end. One is the bombing war. The other was the Battle of the Atlantic. There was fighting at sea between the Allies and the Axis from the first day of the war in Europe to the end. The bomber offensive went on almost as long. And it is a very interesting and very significant campaign. These airmen were blazing new trails. And in some ways, World War II was the first laboratory to actually test these ideas that came out of the First World War for how air power, how strategic bombing of enemy industry and populations might actually affect warfare. Now, the cost of this was phenomenal in terms of human life, in terms of civilian casualties in Germany and Italy and the occupied nations of Europe. The cost to the bomber crews was extraordinary. You had a better chance of surviving the war unscathed if you were a Marine fighting in the Pacific than if you were an 8th Air Force bomber crew in 1943. The consequences are still controversial. There are those who argue that the air offensive didn't really accomplish all that much, that the resources could have been used better elsewhere. I'm going to address those critiques and those ideas tonight. And also for us today, every time you pick up a newspaper and read about use of air power in Iraq in '91, Iraq in 2003, Syria today, the Middle East, planning for future conflict, these questions about what can air power accomplish, can air power do the job, they still come up. And these debates were really framed by the actions and the results of World War II. So yes, this is history, but we are still living a lot of these ideas. Now, to understand the World War II bomber offensive, you really have to go back to what the British still call the Great War. We call it World War I or the First World War. The reason air power developed the way it did was in large part conditioned by the slaughter in the trenches from 1914 to 1918. Millions of the flower of European manhood were killed in the trench warfare. The slaughter of going over the top, charging machine guns, crossing no man's land. At the French military academy at Saint-Cyr, they have memorial plaques to all the members of the graduating classes who died in France's wars. For the class of 1914, there are no names. It simply says the class of 1914. That conditioned the airmen, the purveyors of this new form of warfare, of a desire to find a better way. Is there a better way to fight war than human slaughter in the trenches against prepared defenses? And you saw some examples in World War I of airmen trying to break the stalemate in the trenches by using air power. The Germans were the first. With their airships and later their Gotha bombers, they attacked targets inside Britain, industrial centers, the capital of London, to both terrorize the population and to disrupt a British industry. Obviously did not win the war for them, but it set a pattern, this idea of how a few aircraft might have an outsized impact. This poster shows the British revulsion and anger about the German air raids. The Royal Air Force followed suit. In 1918, the RAF put together what was called the Independent Force. It was a force of bombers designed to attack into German territory, to attack German industrial plants, and hopefully cut off the supply of war material to the front. Now, the war ended before any of this could really have much of an effect. So you look objectively at World War I, you'd say the air power, very important for observation and ground support, but strategic bombing was an unproven concept. Didn't matter. Going into the interwar period, airmen like Marshal of the Air Force Sir Hugh Trenchard believed that air power was the best way to fight, and he pushed it strenuously. And he'll have counterparts in this country, people like Billy Mitchell. Trenchard looked at the possibilities. He didn't look at the lessons of the war. He looked at the possibilities of the new technology and said, with air power, attack is the stronger form of war. Attack is the best defense. The nation that can build up an air force and strike the enemy hard and quickly will win the war. He also theorized that air power had a psychological, or what he called the morale effect, that it could discourage and defeat populations psychologically through the terrifying effects of aerial bombing. He particularly thought that industrial workers would desert their factories in the face of bombing. So these were ideas that helped shape air forces before the war. Many air forces went to school on these ideas and built up bomber forces. Now, World War II breaks out, and it does not start with massive strategic bombing offensives. It starts with some fairly dramatic German victories using combined arms warfare on the ground. The Blitzkrieg in Poland, the Low Countries, France, Scandinavia. So the Germans are in possession of the entire Western European landmass. And Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, has a problem. He has to come up with an idea, how can we strike back at the Germans when our armies have been defeated and evacuated at Dunkirk from the continent? Churchill turned to air power and said, with a bombing offensive, we can use our air force to weaken Germany and eventually bring her down. So the British bomber offensive begins, as I said, in the very first weeks of the war. British bombers are striking targets in Germany. They are flying by daylight, and they are flying without fighter protection. And those first raids are disasters. They lose most of the formations, 50%. In one case, they lost 80% of the bombers that were sent over German territory. So very quickly, the British switch from daylight bombing to bombing at night. Now, it is safer flying at night because the German night fighter defenses are not very advanced in the early part of the war. And so the bombers can generally return to their bases without being destroyed, but finding the targets is very, very difficult at night or in bad weather. The British think they are actually doing a lot better than they are. They think that they are finding and hitting vital targets within Germany, but the British are thorough, and so they do a study. Each airplane carried a flash bomb that would drop after the bombs dropped and illuminate the target for a picture to be taken, so you could know pretty much where the bombs landed. And so the British commissioned a study, the Butt Report, in mid-1941 to analyze the target, the strike photos. And they only analyzed the photos of the crews that actually claimed to have struck the target. The ones that said, yeah, we didn't know where we were, we just dumped our bombs, those weren't counted. These are the crews that said, yes, by Jove, we hit the target. They found that in all the attacks on Germany, 1 bomb in 5 got within 5 miles of the target. When they were attacking the heavily defended Ruhr industrial regions, it was 1 bomb in 10 got within 5 miles of the target. When these statistics were briefed in the House of Commons, one member of Parliament said, so in other words, when our Royal Air Force claims that it has dropped 200,000 pounds of bombs on Germany, what we've actually done is exported 200,000 tons of metal in the general direction of Germany. Clearly, they're not doing the job. Churchill starts to question whether or not bombing is, in fact, a viable war strategy. But things are changing. I mean, air forces, like most military organizations, will learn, and they are getting better. New aircraft come online, bigger bombers, bigger bomb loads, navigational aids, electronic warfare really starts to get important, and the British bombers are getting more and more able of finding their target. The British decide that hitting targets precisely at night is probably not going to happen. So in early 1942, they decide that the strategy would involve attacking area targets. They said the big German industrial towns have enough important stuff within the city limits that attacking the entire target is a viable strategy. In certain circles, this strategy was called dehousing. The idea was to strike the as well as the industrial plant, also the German labor force them into homelessness, reduce their morale, but also destroy the physical means of waging war. It wasn't just a psychological campaign, it was a combination of physical destruction and the psychological effect. The Bomber Command also received a new commander, Sir Arthur Harris. The press called him Bomber Harris. His crews called him Bert or Butcher Harris. And it was not clear whether they meant butcher of the Germans or butcher of his crews because the losses were heavy. But Harris was a forceful organization man, and he whipped Bomber Command into a very effective instrument of war. He is on the cover of Time magazine. You see the hammers pounding the German swastika with the hammers have the British aircraft insignia on them. He was a firm believer in the strategy. He did not invent the strategy. The strategy had been determined already. He was put in charge to implement it. One of the first things he does is he says, I want to put 1,000 bombers over a German target. He picked Cologne. He scraped together every aircraft he could lay his hands on, including ones from training schools. And in May of 1942, he launched a 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne. The effect on the Germans was powerful. They realized that their airspace was not well defended, and they would have to make some changes. Also, Harris presides over an extraordinary process of electronic innovation and operations research to get his bombing force to be as effective and as destructive as humanly possible. He relentlessly honed the effectiveness of the force, and by 1943, Bomber Command was a sledgehammer, that if it hit the target accurately, meaning an area target, our results were pretty devastating. He turned his air crews against the Ruhr, the heart of Germany's industrial output for steel production and basically heavy industry in early 43. He attacked the town of Hamburg, the port city of Hamburg, in July of 1943, in the process creating the first firestorm. A hurricane of fire fueled by incendiaries, hurricane force winds whipped through the city. 40,000 members of the population of Hamburg died in a single night. When rescue crews weeks later forced their ways into a number of the air raid shelters, they had to estimate the casualty total because there was nothing but fine ash inside the air raid shelters. This was a devastating form of war, but it was effective. The German armaments minister said, if the British can do that to 6 more cities, that will end the war. That was hard to have results on that scale, though. The British weren't able to do it. In late 1943, early 44, Harris turned his command to Berlin and said, we can wreck Berlin from end to end. It will cost Germany the war. And they did raid Berlin many times, but Berlin is a much tougher target, and Bomber Command was not able to destroy Berlin and knock Germany out of the war. In any case, the RAF was re-rolled, if you will, to support for the upcoming invasion of Europe. All the strategic air forces were. So the conclusion by mid-1944 was that Bomber Command had inflicted grievous damage on Germany, but had not ended the war. Now, I mentioned that this was a new form of war. It was particularly new for the British crews that flew at night, this night air offensive. They had to deal with German anti-aircraft fire. As you'll see, the Americans had the same problem. But also the Germans had very, very effective night fighters, which they developed, which carried their own radar and could intercept the bombers. All kinds of techniques and technologies were employed, and some of them were actually myths. In RAF pilot reports, crew reports, you'll get these references to what were called scarecrow shells. The crews would come back and say, we saw the Germans were firing these anti-aircraft shells that exploded in a certain way that looked like an exploding bomber to demoralize us. Debris would fly down, but it was a fake, and we knew it was a fake, so we kept flying. After the war ended, British intelligence is interrogating German air commanders and anti-aircraft commanders, and they ask about the scarecrow shells. And the response is, there was never any such thing. Why would we develop a weapon like that? Those were all exploding bombers. The scarecrow shell was a defense mechanism that the crews came up with to not think about their limited chances of survival. The Germans developed a device which they codenamed jazz music. These were 30-millimeter cannons mounted to fire upwards. The Germans realized British bombers did not have a belly turret. There was no one observing below. So the German night fighter would come up underneath the British bomber, line up, and fire upward. So the first the British bomber crew knew there was a problem was when 30-millimeter shells started crashing through the floor. This was a very, very costly form of warfare. LMF, does anyone know what that is? Yeah, the lack of moral fiber. If there was a British air crew or a pilot who started to crack, who started to question the validity of the missions, that individual would be branded having lack of moral fiber and would be removed abruptly from the unit. The thought was that this would spread to the rest of the outfit, so you had to get people who had had too much just out of the unit. A very cruel practice, but the leadership thought it was necessary. The corkscrew. If the German night fighter was spotted in time, the pilot of the RAF bomber would throw the bomber into a hair-raising multiple G-force maneuver called the corkscrew to shake the night fighter off and spoil its aim. None of these concepts existed before the war. They all grew up during the war. And finally, you didn't talk about getting killed in Bomber Command. You talked about getting the chop. And if your mates told you that the chop rate in the unit was going up, everybody knew what that meant. Okay, as I mentioned, this is a combined bomber offensive, and the RAF was already pretty far down its own bombing campaign when the United States Army Air Force arrived. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, the buildup of the 8th Air Force in the UK starts. It's a tremendous effort to create strategic air forces, the 8th and later the 15th in Europe. Of course, the 8th Air Force starts slow. What were called milk runs, easy operations against coastal targets, still within the range of protective Spitfire fighter cover from the United Kingdom. You know, coastal targets, U-boat pens, easy to find, easy to hit, not easy to destroy. The U-boat pens, you'll see some if you go on that trip. They're still there. The bombs could not penetrate. But they're targets because Britain is being strangled by the submarine campaign, and we had to do something, so the Air Force was called in. Now many of the airmen said that the fact that the Air Force could do a number of different things, like support the operations in the Mediterranean, meant that it was drained away. It was diverted from the primary mission of bombing Germany by all these distractions. And there is some truth in that. So it is not until January 1943, this is when Bomber Command has been flying over Germany in increasing strength for a couple of years, that the 8th Air Force finally strikes Wilhelmshaven, a target on German soil. So January 43. 43, that is also the occasion of the Memphis Belle, which is credited with being the first B-17 to complete a tour of operations. The famous documentary film was shown to try to encourage the American people to support the idea of the bomber offensive, really just as it was getting going. Now, in terms of the theory that the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force eventually would use, it was actually developed at the air base where I currently teach, Maxwell Field in Alabama. Before the war, was home of what was called the Air Corps Tactical School. And their job was to create what they called doctrine, or ideas for the best way to use an Air Force in war. What they came up with is a little different than the British idea of attacking whole cities. The American concept was much more mechanistic. It was much more industrially focused. They said that by analyzing industry, you can say you don't have to destroy the entire industry. There are these key factories or even key buildings within factories that if you can destroy them, the whole structure will come crashing down like a house of cards. And the idea was it was possible using intelligence and analysis to identify these targets and strike them from the air and knock out Germany without the need for an invasion in the best case. These were called choke points, these key points, and power generation was a big one. Transportation nodes, as well as oil production, were all identified as key targets. And along with that, the theorists at Air Corps Tactical School said the bombers can probably protect themselves if they're big enough and have enough defensive armament. And at the time they're working, the American bombers are actually capable of outflying the fighters of the day, because the airline industry provided a lot of technology to build large, heavy, fast aircraft with a big payload. There wasn't much of a civilian market for pursuit planes, fast, high-altitude interceptors. So they were correct when they came up with this idea that the bombers could probably fly higher and faster than most fighters. That would not be true by the time the war actually broke out. But they still went to war with the self-defending bomber formation. This was all put together in a master air plan called Air War Plans Division I, which was kind of the targeting roadmap for the American Air Forces in World War II. Now, as far as it being a combined bomber offensive, the leaders, the big leaders of the alliance met in Casablanca in 1943 and hammered out an agreement that the British would attack Germany by night and the Americans would attack Germany by day, bombing round the clock, undermining the morale. Basically, each Air Force got to do pretty much what it wanted. The question is, how combined was it? Occasionally, the Air Forces would coordinate strikes on a target system. More often than not, these really ought to be seen as parallel air campaigns. Now, the German defenses their value was not probably appreciated enough by the pre-war planners. Now, the German Air Force was built for attack, not for defense. The Germans preferred to use their aircraft to support the army and to strike the enemy's industrial targets. The Germans did not think air defense was that important. When they did talk about it, they talked about a combined arms approach between anti-aircraft guns, or what they called flak, and pursuit fighters. But in 39-41, the German air defenses are very minimal. There are anti-aircraft guns protecting the major cities, and there's a thin screen of fighter planes at the frontier, but you do not have anything like what would happen later with a defense in depth. Now, what the Germans will do, though, they react very, very quickly. When the British start bombing at night and the Americans start probing German airspace by day, the Germans very quickly reorganize their air force to deal with this offensive. There's organizational changes. The command and control system is adjusted to deal with intercepting bomber formations. Their tactics and technology will evolve. Bomber-destroying weapons, rockets, heavy cannon are developed. And the Germans resigned themselves to fighting essentially a 24-hour air war. The same controllers would have to deal with a night attack, and then the next day they'd have to deal with the 8th Air Force. An important thing to keep in mind in terms of assessing how effective was the bomber offensive, by late 1943, this is the major focus of the Luftwaffe. All the other things an Air Force could be doing, they're mostly focused on defense by late 1943. This is an example. This is a curtain of flak, so thick you could get out and walk on it, was what the crews would say. Now, there was an analysis done after the war that said flak wasn't really that effective. It took 30,000 rounds of 88 millimeter fire to destroy a single bomber. And that may well be true, but the point of flak was not to make bombers crash. The point of flak was to make bombers miss. And if you're a bombardier flying into this and you're trying to line up on your target, odds are you will not be focusing 100% on your task. And if the bombs miss the precision target, the mission is a failure. And so flak is designed to disrupt bombers more than it is to destroy them. So in the fullness of time, flak has been seen as a lot more effective than it later was. This is a diagram. The 8th Air Force did a survey of German fighter tactics, and they identified this bewildering number of different stratagems that the fighters would employ. This one's called the Rocketeers. The German fighter planes would line up out of 50 caliber range and fire 210 millimeter rockets into the formation. They would explode, the formation would break up, and without the mutual defense of the formation, the fighters would race in and individually deal with the stragglers. The tactical lessons on this thing says the stragglers number is up. Keep in formation at all costs after explosion of rocket projectiles. So each side is learning and changing. It's like a chess game. So throughout 1943, the 8th Air Force presses deeper and deeper into Germany. They have to leave their fighter escort behind because they're flying longer range missions. And these are deep penetration missions, and they are phenomenally important air battles. But the losses of the 8th Air Force become unsupportable, culminating with the second Schweinfurt raid of 14 October, 600 heavy bombers. Nearly 25% of the force fails to return from the mission. Many of the other bombers that return carry dead or dying crewmen. The offensive essentially is brought to a halt by the German air defenses in the fall of 1943. So the Army Air Forces under General Hap Arnold reorient themselves and say that eliminating the German Air Force will be the first priority before we can do anything else. And so the focus becomes getting the German Air Force up to fight, where it can be destroyed in the air. And that is only possible with the advent of long-range fighter escort, a technological change, fighters that can accompany the bombers all their way to the target and back. They would do this in relays. And during Big Week in February 44, which was a major attack on the German aircraft industry and attacks on Berlin, the point here was, yes, to bomb the targets, but it was also to bring the Luftwaffe up to fight. And in enormous battles of air attrition, the Germans lost their entire front line 2 times over during 1944. The battle for air superiority was really won in the air, not in the factories that was bombed. Now, there were target systems that emerged as very important and in fact, decisive. One was the attack on the German synthetic oil industry. The Germans had no natural POL resources. They had to manufacture avgas from coal, and the plants that made it were very large and very vulnerable, and they couldn't be moved underground. So attacking the oil industry was the Achilles heel. The transportation plan, the ability of the Germans to move stuff around, bringing troops to the combat fronts and bringing supplies around within the Reich, that was disrupted throughout 1944. The cumulative effects of this was that the German war machine was grinding down, independent of anything that was happening on the combat fronts. Germany was starting to die from within from this bomber offensive. Now, there are criticisms of this strategy. There were those that said it was ineffective. There were authors like the economist John Kenneth Galbraith said that if you look at what the Germans were manufacturing, the numbers of aircraft they're manufacturing, the more we bomb them, the more stuff they seem to manufacture. There's a production surge in Germany despite the heaviest bombing. And that is true, but as you'll see, it's not the whole story. Bless you. There are those that say it failed to deliver on the pre-war promise. We still had to invade. We still had to fight Normandy. We still had to fight the Battle of the Bulge. That is true. There were airmen who predicted confidently that an invasion would not be necessary because of the bombing. That was overpromising. The idea of opportunity costs in economics. What couldn't we do because we spent so much blood and treasure and human capital on the bomber offensive? Could we have built more landing craft? Could we have built more tactical aircraft? Those discussions are out there that possibly the bomber offensive used up resources that could have been applied elsewhere. There's also fingers pointed at intelligence failures, misunderstanding the nature of the German war economy. Certain targets that we thought were very important turned out to be not that important, or like ball bearings. The Germans found ways to get around our attacks on ball bearing attacks. So there certainly were intelligent failures. The cost was certainly enormous. I've stressed that. The air crews that were lost and the blood and treasure that was spent. A fairly significant critique is the idea that it ignored friction, that AWPD-1 just kind of laid out mathematically this many planes, this many bombs, this many targets, overlooking the kinds of things that actually happened in the air. This is a picture taken from a B-17 in a bomber box. The plane below has slipped out of its place in formation just as the bombs were released. The bombs clipped the horizontal stabilizer, and that particular B-17 went down onto the target after its bombs. It was hard in pre-war calculations to calculate for stuff like this. Things like the weather. The weather in England was very much like the weather we had today, that fog, that low fog. This is the case of a bomb group. They're actually coming back from a mission, and the airfield was completely fogged in. You can barely see the other airplanes. There's actually 20 airplanes within the frame of the photograph. You can only see a few of them. Not surprising, 2 of them collided. And not a single individual in each of the 10-man bomb crews escaped with his life on this particular day. So it's hard to build a plan that takes all this stuff into account. So that is a criticism, but also the fact the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force managed to solve a lot of these problems with navigational aids and safety procedures. But it took time. All right, there's other criticisms that said we assumed that if the Germans were bombed in sufficient strength, they would simply crumble. And in fact, the Germans proved very, very resourceful and very resilient, just as the Koreans did during the Korean War, just as North Vietnam did during the Vietnam War. There's a tendency to assume the enemy will simply fall in line with what you're doing, and that, of course, wasn't the case. The moral questions are significant. If you look at what happened and who died in Germany, most of the casualties, particularly in the British bombing offensive, were German civilians, women, children, and elderly people, since most of the men were at the front. Now, a lot of factory workers were killed, and you can argue that they were certainly part of the war effort, but it is a fact that the bomber offensive killed many what we would consider innocence. And I think we do need to reflect on that. Whether there was an alternative and what the intention was, there have been books that have come out recently that suggest that there was no moral difference between the Allied bombing offensive and the German massacre of the Jews during the Holocaust at the concentration camps. Now, there's a rejoinder to that from an economic historian named Adam Tooze. It's very brief, and I'd just like to read you his rejoinder. He says, to describe the destruction of Germany in 1945 in the language of the Holocaust is both obscene and inaccurate. This was a war, not a massacre of the innocents. It may have felt like slaughter to those on the receiving end, but this was an effect of the means used, not the ends intended. Nazi Germany had challenged 3 of the greatest industrial powers on earth. It had taken them 5 long years to bring their industrial might fully to bear, but now their war machines were fully assembled, and in the first 5 months of 1945, they cut their way into the territory of Germany with truly horrendous results. If you want to look at the effects of the bombing offensive, I think you have to consider these factors, and some of which are indirect effects. But the larger question is, well, what did all this effort, all this strategizing accomplish? So you look at war production, you look at the broader effects on the economy, the questions of air superiority. We'll talk about personnel, and and basically what it forced the enemy to do. All right, to start off with, the effect on German war production. The German war economy was mobilized for a war, but it was mobilized for a short war. The Germans built up some very capable military forces, but they had not gambled on a multi-year war against the 3 largest industrial powers on earth. So they are in a bind. Now, the Germans were incredibly resourceful. This man, Albert Speer, the German Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, created what he himself liked to refer to as the armaments miracle. He ruthlessly rationalized production. He says, you will not waste raw materials. We will allocate exactly what you need. You will build fewer designs to maximize production. All these changes. He hardened some of the factories. He put some factories underground. He developed industrial workarounds. He thought the German war economy used too many ball bearings, and he figured out you could cut back and still have the same effectiveness of weapons. He did all these things, and yet the bombing put a lid on the expansion of the German war economy. If you look at the resources they had and the industrial plant at their disposal, they should have produced a lot more. It was really the RAF's bombing of the Ruhr that capped German industrial expansion and kind of kept it in the box. Now, but economists like John Kenneth Galbraith point, well, look at the index of production. They're producing more airplanes in September 1944 than they ever did. That was the month of the heaviest bombing. But you look at what they are making. They're almost exclusively manufacturing air defense fighters. They're not manufacturing bombers. They're not manufacturing ground attack airplanes for the hard-pressed troops on the Eastern Front. They're producing air defense fighters, which are smaller and easier to manufacture. Also, they are making mostly obsolescent weapons. They are mass-producing proven types that have seen their best days. And so what they're producing is not frontline stuff. Its numbers are there, but the German war economy is not efficiently producing quality materials. Now, Speer did disperse the industries and save some of his factories by destruction by moving them around. But when you move factories around like that, when you separate functions, you lose what economists call economies of scale. It makes sense to have, like Willow Run, the B-24 factory, a bomber would roll out of the factory every hour because everything was under one roof. In Germany, that's a huge target. So Speer dispersed the factories. But what that meant was you have got to get the components together for final assembly. At some point, that requires transportation. And the German railroad system was completely broken up from the bombing. The Germans made a lot of stuff. But most of it ended up like this. Most of it never got to a squadron. There were 1,400 Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters produced. We figure about 400 of those actually made it to a squadron and into combat. The rest were sitting somewhere, and maybe not even fully assembled, but yes, they were manufactured. Things you don't think about. The Germans are strapped for labor by 1944. They bring in millions of slave laborers from the eastern territories. How enthusiastic do you imagine a slave laborer is turning a wrench on the industrial line? When the Air Force Museum at Dayton restored an ME-163 rocket plane that they had, they knew a little bit about the history of the airplane, and they knew that it had never flown. This particular model had never flown. And when they stripped it down and cleaned it, they found that most of the bolts that held the wing onto the fuselage were missing. In their place was a matchstick mashed down and puttied over, and scratched into the paintwork in French was a little diagram of a broken heart, and in French it said, "My heart is not occupied." This airplane was sabotaged on the line by a very courageous slave laborer who left his mark. The Germans had to deal with that in terms of overall quality. Things like engine testing. They're running out of fuel. So aircraft engines, which should have been bench tested for 30 hours, were given a cursory blip and then installed in a fighter, and off you go. Many times those engines failed due to declining manufacturing standards, which were completely out the window by late 1944. I spent a year at the Air and Space Museum, and they were restoring a German bomber there. And when they took it apart, they found out that the pieces simply didn't fit together very well. They had huge quantities of the German equivalent of Bondo was slapped on the airplane. And a pre-war German aircraft was a marvel of engineering. You couldn't get a piece of paper between the wing and the fuselage. These late war things were very poorly manufactured by subcontractors using inferior, what were called ersatz materials. And yes, the miracle weapons, the jet fighters, those were impressive, but you have to realize the metallurgy in those was so poor that the Me-262's engines could run for about 8 hours before they threw a turbine blade. This is an interesting photograph. As we heard in the last talk, this is probably the best German fighter of the war, the FW-190D, long nose. This is a crash version downed in the last weeks of the war. Notice the propeller. It's made of wood. The Germans are having to use non-strategic materials, a lot of plywood and major components. Strategic materials are just out of stock, and they have to make do with inferior replacements. Hard to chart this effect on a production chart, but the fact is German weapons, because of the bomber offensive, they ain't what they used to be. There's also opportunity cost for the Germans. What do the Germans prefer to use their Air Force for? It's supporting their victorious army in blitzkrieg operations. Once the Allied air offensive begins, that capability dries up. The bomber offensive forces the Germans to strip the combat fronts. Fighter units from Russia come back to the homeland. Fighter units from Italy and the Mediterranean are pulled back as the German Air Force goes into a defensive crouch, and the troops at the front line simply have to make do. As you probably know, there's only 2 German fighters in the air on the morning of D-Day. All the rest is back home protecting key German targets. When the Soviet offensive in June of 1944 explodes in Belarus, the Germans have a handful of fighters to deal with that. The Ju-88 was their best, most versatile multi-role aircraft. It was a heck of a bomber, but after 1943, it's being built exclusively as a night fighter for air defense, not as a bomber aircraft. This is from a British perspective. This was from a then classified examination of the Luftwaffe right after the end of the war. And this portion I've highlighted in red, and above all else, it enforced a changeover from bomber to fighter, offensive to defensive equipment, which irrevocably altered the whole composition and character of the German Air Force. That is an extremely significant effect of the bombing offensive. As I mentioned, air superiority was gained through a different mechanism. It was not gained because the Germans couldn't build airplanes in their factories. It was gained because their aircraft and their best pilots were killed in aerial combat dealing with the American escort fighters. And as I said, the Luftwaffe lost its entire frontline strength several times over. This is a quote from the inspector of German fighter aviation: "Our weapon is in sight of collapse." In terms of the Normandy invasion, Dwight Eisenhower was able to tell his men, if you see planes overhead, they will be ours. And the Germans had a saying too. German army troops would crack wise with this joke in Normandy, trying to resist the Allied onslaught. If it's painted, it's British. If it's natural metal, it's American. If it's not there, it's German. The reason the invasion stripes were put on was to prevent friendly fire. The biggest danger in Normandy for an Allied aircraft was being fired at by our own forces. And so the invasion stripes, heck with camouflage, we just need to mark these as friendlies. There's a huge personnel impact as well. Many of you know the Germans had some fighter pilots who had 200 and 300 kills, many of them on the Eastern Front, but many in the West as well, because they trained their pre-war cadre of aviators to astronaut standards of training. When the war started, the Germans had to cut corners because they needed to ramp up throughput of fighter pilots and bomber pilots. And whenever you're pressed, like for fuel, the first thing the Germans cut was fuel allocations to the training schools. So the training syllabus becomes progressively watered down. Things like bad weather flying were cut out of the syllabus to save time, fuel, and effort. So German pilots are crashing their aircraft with astonishing regularity. A lot of that production surge, part of the reason it never got to the squadrons was because the pilots crashed their airplanes before the Allies could do it for them. By mid-1944, it's correct to talk about two Luftwaffes. You have a handful of these super highly skilled fighter aces who were never rotated out, by the way. They fought until they were killed, wounded, or promoted out of the job. And you have green pilots with, in some cases by late 1944, I've noticed from German documents, you have guys turning up at the unit with 11 hours of experience in the airplane that they're supposed to fly in combat. In some cases, they could barely control their aircraft in the air, much less engage in combat maneuvers with a very well-trained American pilot. All right, just so to wrap up, I think there's a synergistic effects going on. We tend to look at the air offensive as if it happened in a vacuum. It did not. As the German war economy is being wrecked by the air offensive, you have the Red Army on the Eastern Front, then you have the Allied Army, the Western Allied armies in Normandy. That effect, the synergistic effect, meant that Germany could not fight the kind of war that it really wanted to. So the bomber offensive, I would conclude, was a huge investment, but there was considerable return on this investment. It was difficult to predict effects, and if Rob Ellers was here, he'd be able to tell you about how the code breaking, which has recently been fully understood, was very helpful in understanding the effect of our bombing by decoding German industrial communications about damage to industrial plant and workarounds that were being contemplated. There certainly were missed opportunities and efficiencies. Even the generally very positive strategic bombing survey said, of course, things could have been done differently or could have been employed more wisely. But again, I remind you, these individuals were blazing new trails. But it really all came down to the sharp end. In the last talk, I was heard a poem called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. This is a ball turret of a B-17 where the gunner was killed. That was probably German 30-millimeter fire that ripped through the... It was a very hard job, one of the hardest jobs in the war, to be an 8th Air Force bomber crewman. They paid the price, but I think they also came through, and I personally think the air offensive ultimately delivered the goods. Just a couple of books that I would recommend that aren't on the handout. Guy Gibson's book, he was the guy that was the dam buster leader, the Ruhr Dams raid. He wrote he was grounded after the dam buster raid, and one of the things he was told to do was write a book about Bomber Command. And it's a very thoughtful book about what it was like to fly British bombers at night during the early part of the war when the Brits were actually losing. I think the American counterpart, Bert Stiles' book, Bert Stiles, had he lived, would have been one of the great American writers, I believe. He would have been another Hemingway. He had already published, as a very young man, some pieces in major magazines, but he went off to war. He was a B-17 co-pilot. He cross-trained into P-51s, and he's killed in action in December 1944. But he wrote a beautiful memoir of his time in the B-17 force. Phillips Payson O'Brien, How the War Was Won. It's a very revisionist look that said the air war and the sea war were much more important than anybody has ever really thought, and he has statistics and charts, and it's very interesting. And finally, Adam Tooze is really one of the historians who's really taken a hard look at the German war economy from inside, and has done a remarkable job of showing the very complex effects of the bomber offensive. That's all I got. We'll have questions and answers once we're all done, but thanks very much for your attention. I sure appreciate it.
Great job, Rob.
Thanks very much.
Well, we've got a couple of gentlemen here that had experiences during the war, and I'm going to introduce them. Ivar Jorgensen is on your left. He was a weatherman. Ivar grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. His father ran a nursery, and he was born in Des Moines in September of 1924. He was inducted into the military in March 17th. Almost got an anniversary coming up here. At Camp Dodge, and did his basic training at Shepherd Field in Wichita Falls, Texas. I lived about 70 miles west of there as I was changing diapers then. He ended up going to weather school at Grand Rapids. And Ivar, tell us some of the things that you were taught in this weather school in Grand Rapids.
We learned a lot about identifying the characteristic temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction, different kinds of clouds, moisture, all these good things. And then this was encoded into teletype reports and sent to a central location, and then that was sent back to us, and we would plot it on a weather map. Like I was stationed in Denver or Lowry Field or Peterson Field, Colorado Springs, and we would plot maps listing all the different things, the temperatures and that, and then a weather forecaster would come in and draw in the isobars and conclude what the weather was going to be like. Colorado Springs is right next to Pikes Peak, you may know, and in the summer we would get a downdraft and oftentimes a thunderstorm around 3:30, 4 o'clock. And every new forecaster that would come in, why, he couldn't see that because he wasn't taught that in school, and it doesn't happen except in that area. We also had a professor from MIT come out to explain to our forecasters how to read the weather map and that kind of stuff. And every morning he would come in and explain that any area that was not correct on the forecast, why it didn't work. And it didn't take long to figure out that backcasting is a hell of a lot more effective than forecasting.
It's kind of like today, right?
To me, today's weather forecasters are just fantastic, but they've got a hell of a lot more equipment to use with the satellite. In fact, in Colorado, we got a bunch of old weather maps, and then we would look at those, and you see the map of today, and then you say, well, where did the old weather map go? And you try and figure that out. Well, the human mind can't handle that, but the computers can, and then with the satellites, you get a lot more information. It's just fantastic, and it's fun to watch what's going to happen in the future. Right now we have these bubbles, like the Twin Cities is warmer than it is out in Tyler, Minnesota, where my son-in-law comes from. It'll stay warmer there. It's easier to forecast for Tyler than it is for Minneapolis.
But I wanted to go back. But your school at Grand Rapids was 12 weeks, right?
12 weeks, yeah.
Now, was that the only place that they trained people getting into the weather business?
No, it was one of the schools. Chinook Field in Illinois was the primary one, and this was just to fill in. There were a few hundred of us that went through school there. I don't know how many classes they had, but we lived in the manufacturer's building downtown, an old warehouse. Then we'd walk through the streets and sing our songs for marching, good old service stuff. Mm-hmm. And we went to the Civic Center, and there we had our classes and had our meals and that. We would go out to the city parks, and that's where we did our shooting and that kind of stuff.
And then from the school, you mentioned you moved initially to Lowry Field, which is in Denver, yeah. And then you were there a short time, and then you moved down to Peterson, and you described some of those experiences. At Peterson, you were in the 23rd Weather Squadron. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah, the weather squadrons, this was out of Kansas City. We were on detached service. Each unit of probably 12 to 15 people were weathermen, and we scattered around the country that way.
And the effort at that point was to measure the temperature, measure winds, to measure the things that people sense at that point, the things you could measure. Is that correct? Cloud covers?
We measured all that kind of stuff and recorded it, and then collected it. It was used over the whole country.
Okay. And so then in September of '45, you were sent to Iceland.
Yeah.
You were at Camp Fraser, was the home base there.
Well, wait, no, let's go back. I was sent to Keflavik to Meeks Field, the airport, and then after I got there, shortly thereafter, then I went to Fraser down at Meeks, at Vic, which is a resort town south of
Reykjavik, right?
Got to be east.
East of Reykjavik.
Yeah.
If any of you have flown Icelandic, you landed close to where Ivor was based at that point. There you were assigned to the 8th Weather Squadron, and tell the story about how the interface was between the American Weather Station and the British that were assigned there.
Well, the weather station was up on a lava mountain about 800 feet above Vic, or the town, and we would walk up this trail to get up there. It was about a mile up, and the British had a radio station or something of that nature up there. They would drive up in American cars or trucks, and we would walk.
One of the other questions that we talked about is the coordination that the Army Air Force weather people did with the Navy. Can you explain that?
Well, in the North, in the 8th Weather Squadron, that was mainly in the North Atlantic, and we would get weather reports from the Navy. Had ships that would stay in a certain location, and they would float around. They would sail around in a certain area and gather weather information and send that on, and it gave additional information for drawing weather maps and making forecasts. When we were going back to the States after my tour there, we started out for Labrador from Iceland, and the weather wasn't good in Labrador, so we landed in Greenland. But to get the information, there was one of these little corvettes. It's smaller than a destroyer, and we circled down to get the information. It took quite a while. We were probably up around 15,000, and the land, you know how smooth the ocean is. from that altitude. You got down close, it was really rocking, and I was glad I was in an airplane.
Okay, let's move on to Bob. Bob Holmstrom was born in Two Harbors, January of 1926. His family was, I think, typical of a lot of families of that time, when the jobs were hard to find, and you find out what you can do. He graduated from high school in '43 from Harding in Minneapolis, was inducted at Fort Snelling, and did his basic at Shepherd Field. I want you guys to coordinate if you guys met each other at Shepherd in that time, because it was about the same time period, if you remember what classes you were in. Bob then went down to Laredo, Texas, Eagle Pass, Texas, and was doing some opportunities to fly, but that didn't happen. Bob, tell us how that your time down in Laredo and Eagle Pass worked.
When we went down to Laredo, Texas, I was signed up to be a fighter pilot. That's the test I passed. And so it never happened. We got some extra training. It was psychological. We were taken and given training of taking apart 50 caliber machine guns. We took them apart and learned with our bare hands. And about 2 weeks later, they turned out the lights, give us a pair of silk gloves, and said, take it apart, put it back together again, make it work. I couldn't understand what that was for. It come to find out that when I was sent to Eagle Pass, Texas, they gave us some more of that same training. And pretty soon, we were off to Mountain Home, Idaho. And in Mountain Home, Idaho, we formed a crew. We were given some more psychological tests to see how we got along with other people, with your unit, with your pilot, comparisons, given problems to sign to figure out, and figure them out in about 5 seconds. No chance to be 15, 20 seconds or a minute later. Your mind had to be active and solve the problem. So our crew was signed together, and that was the one I flew with during the whole war. And we had a magnificent crew. My pilot was very good. Our navigator was one of the top in his class. When we come back from a flight or went to a flight, he could tell us exactly where we were.
Bob, the plane you were using at Mountain Home was a B-24?
A B-24, 4 engines, dual tail, and 10 people on the aircraft.
Was it painted black when you were at Mountain Home?
No, not at Mountain Home. They were not painted black. We had no idea where we were going.
But you know that you'd been through some special training, that you didn't know what you were going to be doing, right?
We didn't know what we were going to be doing, but when we were training, Idaho is pretty mountainous, and we were flying through those mountains 500, 600 feet high, and we were flying at night, and that's what they ended up doing during the war, flying at night, black airplane, and it was kind of treacherous. We actually lost more airplanes in Idaho crashing because the pilots weren't completely trained yet, and neither were we. So quite a few of them were crashed.
And when you say crash, they just crashed into a mountain or into the forest up there? I'm familiar with that area.
That's correct. They hit a mountain, they were done.
Okay, so after 3.5 months of training there at Mountain Home, you were part of the 506 Squadron, correct?
The
406, I'm sorry.
406.
And what was going to be the mission of the 406th?
The 406 was called, in Europe, we were called the Leaflet Squadron. We dropped leaflets to the underground, allowing them to travel. We dropped counterfeit money. We dropped surrender leaflets, false
Credentials, papers, yeah.
yeah. So we would confuse the Germans. So, and then during different trips, we'd drop different articles, but never a bomb. Our unit never dropped a bomb during the whole war. We supported 350,000 underground people in Europe.
Well, I want to go back though. One thing, after you left Mountain Home, your crew went down to Kansas City to pick up a new plane, and the plane wasn't ready for you.
No, yeah, the planes, they couldn't make them fast enough. They didn't have a B-24 that we could fly over to Europe. So we were sent then to Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia, and we stayed there for a couple days, and pretty soon we took a bus and went over to the ocean, and we were put aboard the Ile-de-France. That was the second largest ship in World War II, just a little bit smaller than the Queen Mary. And we sailed over to Europe, and we sailed across the North Atlantic, and I'd never been on the ocean before, but I was feeling mighty poorly, I tell you. We were stationed on the sun deck, and we had 12 guys to a room, to a stateroom, and then the toilet in between, and then another stateroom. So we were halfway comfortable. We weren't crowded out at all. But food was bad. It was a British mess hall. We lived on Hershey bars and whatever else we could get a hold of, because the food was terrible.
Well, did you spend some time leaning over the rail?
No, I didn't get that far, but I was sure upset, I'll tell you.
Well, I understand that. I went over on a troop ship in 1962, and I was on an American ship. The food was great, but I couldn't eat it because I couldn't hold it down. I was leaning over the side all the time. You ended up arriving in the Firth of Clyde, and what happened after you arrived?
Oh, that was very interesting. When we approached the Firth of Clyde, they pulled back the submarine nets so we could get in. And evidently, a German submarine come in the same time. And so we couldn't unload the ship. We had to pull to the side, and they found the German submarine and sunk it. But it was, I knew then we were in a war, you know. Before then, we were just training. But now I seen the submarine sunk. But the Firth of Clyde was just so nice, and Scotland looked so pretty. All the houses and everything. The sun was out when we were there, and it took us about 3 days to get off the ship. We had about 8,000 people aboard the ship. It was really crowded. So then we went by rail down to our station.
And the first place you went to was Cheddington.
Cheddington, England, yes.
And there you were selected to be on another B-24, correct?
That was our first experience of seeing a black B-24. And there we flew 5 missions out of there before they closed down the base, because Axis Sally would come over and the radio, and she'd tell us when we were going to go to over Europe. How they had German spies in there, I have no idea, and the OSS didn't know, and SOE, Special Operations Executive for the British, couldn't figure it out either. So then we moved to another base.
And then you moved from there to Harrington Field, and from there you did 30 missions. Now, you told me you did leaflets from there, you dropped pigeons, you dropped arms, you dropped bicycles and motorcycles. Tell us about your experience of dropping those in and the special conditions of dropping them in.
On one trip, we were flying way into Germany with the Danube River, and we were flying about 450 feet high, 500 feet, at about 175 miles an hour. My pilot had to follow the river, which was curved quite a bit, and we got to the checkpoint to throw out pigeons. Now the pigeons were in a what you could figure out, an oatmeal, Quaker oatmeal box with a small parachute, and that parachute, let me tell you how I did it first. I got out of my tail turret, had 2 straps on each side of the airplane that fastened to my parachute harness so I wouldn't fall out the hole. And the hole was about as wide as this table and about 4 feet long. Now I had to get down on my hands and knees and take off some of my radio equipment, and the waist gunner would hand me this box of pigeons. Now I had to lean down and put my face right out in the air and throw them as hard as I could. Now that little box of pigeons had a small parachute also on it, and that parachute would explode at 100 feet and open up that parachute, had a barometric bruise on it, so that would explode, and pigeon would land safe with 3 days of food and the capsule and stuff, so the Patriots could write out their message that they had to send back to London, ordering whatever they needed to live with, whether it was food or ammunition or hand grenades or machine guns or maybe blood plasma, just anything that they would need to supply. They were the campers that was fighting the Germans, that helped shorten the war, they tell us, by at least 1.5 years by what we did during the war.
Did you always go, if that unit, if that pigeon that went back to England and said, hey, I need ammunition, would you be the unit that would come back to that location and provide that?
Not necessarily. One of our units would be. It all depends what our rotation had been, because we only flew like 17 nights during the month. We had to be able to see the ground. That was the most important thing, and our intelligence officers wanted us to tell when we got back what we had seen, any Germans on the ground or gun emplacements or big groups of Germans or anything like that. So no, we never knew who was going to go there.
How did you know where to drop it? Was there did they put a light down or some kind of a signal that you knew where your target was?
Anytime there was a drop over Europe, regardless of where it was, there was always 3 fires in a row, 3 lights in a row, and one off to the left or the right. Now, we had to make one pass to make sure that that was where we were supposed to be, because the Germans got a little twisty and they kind of figured out what we were doing. So then we would make the second pass and make the drop. And the Patriots would pick it up, whatever we dropped, and buried the parachutes and anything that was visible to the Germans, and go back to the mountains, the woods, and hide out until they used their equipment.
But when you dropped arms, you dropped those in kind of metal cases.
When we dropped some equipment, it was in a cylinder that was, I could just about reach around that cylinder, and it was about 7-8 feet long, and it would hold 330 pounds of food, medicine. We would pack it with rifles, like I said, and dynamite caps, and it had a buffer on the bottom, a cushion that was about this thick, and it would had a parachute on it, and that would open up almost immediately when we dropped it, because we dropped it from about anywhere from 400 to 500 feet high, and we had to slow down to around 125 miles an hour, just above stalling speed practically, so they wouldn't rip the parachutes and destroy the articles.
When you dropped the bicycles, tell us about the bicycles that you dropped.
Well, the bicycles were a very important part of our unit and what we did. Because the women spies were the best ones that we had. They could communicate with one outfit and another spy unit, because the men would either be in the Army or be old and be in an old age home. The bicycles were on a parachute. They were folded up, so not really folded, but tied together, both wheels tied together and all that stuff. And they contributed greatly to the movement of the war.
But there was a separate kind of a container that the bicycles went in, correct?
Yes.
And the same for the motorcycles? The motorcycles
were built by the Germans, by the English people, and they folded in half. There's one in our museum over in England yet. Then they'd had a separate parachute for that. It was a goofy-looking thing. It had to be, to fold it in half and have it work when you get done.
And I want to tell a story. We've talked about some of the equipment. We did a program probably in 1994. Jenny, do you remember? It was way back when. But we had a gentleman, a veteran that lived in South Minneapolis by the name of WWII. And he was in he was called a Joe. The agents, the agents that they dropped out, some were British, some were French, some were American, but they were called Joes. At that time, again, I'm doing this program for 32 years. Some of this stuff kind of runs together. But they dropped him out of they took the bottom ball turret gunner out of the B-24. They put in a slide. And so what would happen is the Joe, he was prepared back in England. He would get at the top of that slide, and just like a kid going down a slide, and out, break the wind stream and come down to earth. At that same program, we had a guy from Cottage Grove that had been a guy preparing the Joes to drop. I think we had 6 or 7 Carpetbagger members at that time. We actually had a major, a retired major, who was planning these operations that lived up in Plymouth, Minnesota. And like all good plans, they never come off the way you want to, right? As I put the program together, I found out that Leif, I shouldn't be telling that now, a wonderful guy, loved him. He and this operations guy were having an affair with the same woman in England. Now, again, that was in 43, 44, and the operations officer refused to be on the program because he didn't want to encounter this Joe that was going to be on the program. But one of my great memories of that program. And if any of you have other interest in this, it hasn't been shown in other places, but there's a book called The Carpetbaggers. You can find it on Abe Books or Barnes & Noble or Amazon. It's about $30, $40 at this point, but it's by a fellow named Ben Parnell. And I spent a lot of time on the phone with Ben. I never met him in person, but he had a brother that was in the Carpetbaggers. And where I'm coming back to this, I want Bob to amplify this. They were sworn to secrecy that they could not say what they did in World War II. Can you speak to that, Bob?
When the war was over and we were sent back to the zone of the interior, that's what they call the United States, the zone of the interior, we were taken into a room, each crew of 10, with a colonel, and raise your right hand, and you will not tell anybody, discuss, or tell any experiences that you had during the war. For 40 years, you will not talk about it. It gets pretty tough to remember when you got to keep your mouth shut for 40 years. So when I go to a reunion, when I started going to the reunions, somebody would remember one thing and another crew would remember something else that we did, what we lived, something funny or something bad. And it stirred something in your mind again or my mind again. And so we finally ended up with some pretty good stories.
And Bob, have you got your book handy there?
Yes, I got it. This book happened to be written almost by my daughter listening to somebody else that was talking in a restaurant. And then a friend of mine run across another person, and they wanted somebody from World War II to write a book about, but they had to be somebody had been in combat. So this lady that wrote the book about my life, starting when I was about 4 years old, and she was a literature teacher, retired, lived up on Iron Range where I had gone to school for a couple of years. And so this book come out, and it was been almost a year now since it's been out. It called Warbirds in the Cloak of Darkness. It shows the moon. We only flew when we could see the moon. I'm standing outside of my airplane here, and she did a very good job. And the book is $20, and I donated all the profits back to the VA system. I donated back to the VA hospital here in Minneapolis. the Veterans Home in Hastings, Minnesota, and the Veterans Home in Minneapolis. And I also gave to my post a $500 thing to help the homeless. But it's $20, we got it for sale, I have a few left. And
And I think you'll sign it too, won't you?
I
Free of
signed,
charge.
all the books are signed already, because I get a little nervous when I getting outside, but on the title page in the inside, I did all that at home. I did maybe a half a dozen at a time and rest my hand and then write some more.
Okay. I want to skip back to Ivor. Ivor came back to the States and went to school in Iowa, got a degree in horticulture at Iowa State, got a master's in horticulture at Nebraska, and spent a career with Northrop King developing some of these little seeds that you guys probably buy in the Northrop King packets. So this is one of the guys that was involved in that. Bob, as we mentioned, came back. He got debriefed because he didn't have enough exciting missions during his time in Europe. The war was over too soon, right? But he came back. He flew back in his B-24 from Scotland to Iceland. And I also want you guys to find out, because you could have very well been in Iceland together, besides Shepherd Field together.
Iceland wasn't a very friendly country. There were more rocks there than you could ever throw the rest of your life.
If you've ever landed in Iceland, it feels like you landed on the moon. That's true.
Yes.
Then he came to La Crosse for a brief period, Sioux Falls, and then ended up helping discharge wax at Fort Dix when he got out in December of '45. Returned to Minnesota, worked for the Swift Company down at the meatpacking plant, then got an opportunity to work for Drake Tile, spent the next 50 years as a tradesman in the tile business and part of the teacher of the apprentice program for the tile industry in Minnesota. Thank you guys very much for this. Rob, let's show that. We're going to show the video.
During World War II, the 492nd Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force and the OSS Packing Station under the direction of SHAPE worked in close cooperation with similar British services to deliver thousands of tons of vital supplies to enemy-occupied countries, successfully arming, controlling, and coordinating the activities of 350,000 resistance members. The 492nd Bomb Group alone flew over 3,000 sorties, carrying more than 7,000 tons of operational supplies, which were used by guerrilla forces to blow up German supply trains, depots, and other military strongpoints. Back in London, unknown to most Americans and Britons, was a handful of people who, working in secrecy, were responsible for the success of these missions. Known as the Carpetbagger Group, they operated from an isolated airdrome at Harrington, where a fleet of B-24s took to the air about 15 nights a month, delivering their cargo of supplies and humans only during the moon period. The packing and storage station for Operation Carpetbagger was at home, about 50 miles from Harrington. Blended into the English countryside, well camouflaged from the air, home was inaccessible to railroad facilities. The logistical problem of getting the cargo to the packing station was solved by rerouting the supplies to a nearby railroad station from where they were taken to home by trucks. 10 officers and 350 enlisted men worked long hours at the railroad station and at home, loading and unloading thousands of rounds of ammunition every day. It was monotonous, hard work, but important work, vital to the men in Europe who needed weapons to throw off their oppressors. According to the daily messages from the underground centers, the daily packing orders were worked out in London and brought by a courier to home, increasing in volume as the guerrilla forces on the continent increased in numbers. Occasionally, the daily packing schedule at home consisted of more than 400 items to go to prearranged reception places on the continent. The heaviest demand of the clandestine resistance personnel was for bazookas, carbines, Stens, Bren guns and small arms, 303 rifles, grenades, and other items especially designed for sabotage. Trained research personnel had designed special types of containers, weighing 300 to 320 pounds when fully packed, with shock-absorbing buffer at one end. The H container, consisting of 5 interchangeable metal cells, was used for standard items. However, each of these 5 cells could be loaded with different material and carry a variety of items. Very often, one of the cells was packed with 400 to 500 rounds of 303 ammunition, carefully wrapped in burlap bags to keep them from slipping. While the next cell contained boots, socks, gloves, and other clothing material, carefully selected to fit the 1944 style in France. Other containers, similarly divided, were used to carry gasoline in jerry cans. Longer items like Brens and other guns were placed in the hollow, one-piece shells of C containers. Every inch of space had to be utilized. Wrapped in burlap bags, the guns were kept in an even position during the flight. Clothing and other items were usually placed around them, with instructions in French on top. Once the clasps were fastened, it was only a matter of days until the guns were in the hands of the Maquis. In another section at home, other material which could not be packed in containers was processed in a different way. Explosives, for instance, had to be handled very carefully. Radio sets, often the only means of communication between London and the underground, were packed in special panniers. These panniers, wire boxes covered with canvas, were stuffed with moisture-resistant Coran fiber, corrugated paper, and hairlock to make them withstand the impact of the drop from the air. Medical supplies, blood plasma, and other breakable items had to be placed in small baskets and tin boxes that were put inside these panniers. A separate cutting and sewing section was working day and night to provide the harnesses necessary to attach parachutes to these panniers and packages. The parachute section provided the chutes, getting the supply requirements of the day ready for shipment. In the course of its operation, Home sent close to 75,000 cargo chutes and a number of personnel chutes on their way to the continent. Then the cargo was taken to the airfield. Meanwhile, at about 11 o'clock each morning, Special Forces headquarters in London had their daily list of targets ready, based on the request of the various underground agents in the field, and phoned them into Harrington. As soon as the phone call came, S2 at Harrington forwarded the list of targets offered by London headquarters to the ops room. The officer in charge marked them on a situation map. Each target was known by the code name of the agent and a number indicating the number of airdrops that had previously been made to that target. A copy of the list was immediately sent to the weather room, where detailed maps of the target area were worked out and brought up to date. Now came the most important moment of the day, the selection of the targets by the commanding officer of Harrington and his staff. Priorities of certain targets, depending on the mission of the individual agent, the number of available aircraft, weather, and flak conditions, all these factors had to be weighed carefully before the decision was made as to which targets would be visited that night. Once the decision was made, the machinery at Harrington swung into gear. S2 notified Special Forces headquarters which targets had been selected. Another call to London informed 8th Air Force headquarters of the proposed route the Carpetbagger planes would take, giving their exact takeoff time and asking for radar clearance for the ships. Then the loading of the planes began. As a rule, 40 to 50 ships were taking off each night. Loading orders were made out specifying the load each plane was going to carry in accordance with the needs of the resistance group to which it was going. Following the loading orders, the ordnance crews started picking up the cargo. C and H containers carrying the weapons of the free world to occupied Europe were loaded onto carriers. Then parachutes were picked up, which were attached to the bucket end of the containers prior to takeoff. From different storage places, panniers containing baskets and tin boxes with sensitive supplies were assembled, along with other miscellaneous items such as tires and bicycles. The supplies were then taken to the planes for loading. The bomb bay of each B-24 had been modified to carry 12 fully packed 300-pound containers that were stored inside the plane like bombs. The same push-button method used to release bombs was employed to drop these containers over France. Panniers and packages were stored forward in the aircraft until after the takeoff. Later, they were placed on small roller conveyors leading to a joe hole cut in the bottom of the fuselage. Static lines were attached to strong points, and upon a signal from the bombardier, the packages went out through the joe hole. While supplies were being loaded into the aircraft, the pilots, navigators, and bombardiers who were going out that night assembled in the briefing room. After a brief introduction by the executive officer, S2 outlined the mission, informing the crew of the flak situation over the target area. Approximately 40 to 50 targets were visited each night without fighter protection. Often there was some human cargo that had to be taken along. agents who had to be dropped on an urgent mission on the continent. Weather and atmospheric conditions were taken up next. Ceiling, visibility, wind velocity, and density. Then the chief navigator outlined the general course on the map, pointing out certain landmarks the pilots were going to hit on their way to the targets. Finally, the pilot of each ship was given his target and, together with his navigator, started working on the flight plans, plotting his individual course. It was usually around 2200 hours when ships and crews were getting ready for the takeoff. In France, the men of the Resistance were already starting on their way to the clandestine reception fields, eagerly waiting for the supplies that would come that night. Once more, the position of containers and panniers were checked to make sure they would arrive in good order. The Jeds, who were going to be dropped along with the cargo that night, arrived on the field, slipping aboard through the Joe hole. Then the operations officer gave orders to flight control to signal the planes for the takeoff. The darkness at Harrington, blinking on and off, the light signals conveyed the orders to the pilots in silence. The first plane roared defiantly toward occupied Europe. The second. The third, until all planes were in the air. At the ops room, the liaison officer reported to 8th Air Force headquarters, the ships were airborne. Another Carpetbagger mission was on its way.
We had another way of communications. We had the first FM radio that was ever made. It was in two pieces, a handheld set and a set up in the air. It was called Joan Eleanor. It was made by two people, and it was named after their wives, Joan and Eleanor's first name. So the radio on the ground had a radius of 3 feet where the person was standing and broadcasting into the air. The Germans could not triangulate and find out where the sound was coming from. Up in the air, we had a British Mosquito at 40,000 feet with a tape recorder up there, a wire recorder. And he could fly in a 60-mile radius and pick up the signal from the FM radio. It was just a marvelous thing. It was, you can't believe how good it was.
I just wanted to know, how long were your missions? How much time did it take?
The missions varied very radically. Sometimes they were like 6 hours and sometimes they were 11. If we flew over towards the Russian border or over to Switzerland, it would be up 10, 11 hours in the air. It was quite strenuous, just being up there flying at night.
This is for the author. What do you believe if the Allies had stopped CBO and dehousing, what do you believe would have happened?
Well, one thing about the German war machine is if you took the pressure off of it, it would recover very quickly. The Germans are taking tremendous losses on the Eastern Front, tremendous losses in Normandy. They had the industrial power to recoup those losses, to replace the equipment. They did that many times during the war, after Kursk, after Falaise. But when the bombing offensive reached its zenith, they were no longer able to do that. So I think if the Allies had stopped the CBO and taken the foot off the gas pedal, the possibility is the Germans could have consolidated, recovered, and established a defensive line that would have made the war drag on for months. So I think it's hard to know because that didn't happen. In fact, it had so much momentum that stopping the CBO just wasn't on. But I think it definitely, even during those last months when it looked like it was piling on, it was actually keeping the German war economy from recovering.
I was curious about the flight. You said you were, I believe, on your flight in, you'd fly at 160 or 70, drop your stuff at 125. Once you dropped, would you crank the power down and fly out at 300 at 400 feet up?
We gained altitude as quick as we could to get away. It all depends where we were. Sometimes we would go up to 18,000 feet and come back, sometimes up to 25,000, depending how far away we were and our gas consumption. We would try to keep under 50 gallons an hour for each engine, 4 engines on our aircraft.
I was sort of wondering about an estimate of the total cost of the air offensive. I mean, you're describing raids like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, 2nd Schweinfurt, Plesty, some of the big weak raids that were 50 to 60 aircraft lost in a single raid, and that Nuremberg raid of the British, they lost 100 planes in that raid. What was the total cost of planes, air crew, and what was the attrition rate like during the worst or most intense of the bomber offensive?
Okay, I think a total cost that they captured, blood, treasure, numbers of aircraft would be, I think very hard to come up with. I think attrition rate, though, that is, we do know that in at the height of the bomber offensive, you were approaching 10% on a maximum effort. And again, just do the math. Both the British and the Americans had a 25 mission tour that was instituted because the crews had to have some kind of a target to shoot for. But they could do math. I mean, I'm a historian, and even I can do math. And the chances of getting through a 25 mission tour unscathed with, say, an 8% loss rate is extremely, extremely narrow. And the crews got very discouraged, but the fact is there were few, if any, combat refusals. The crews, rucked up and flew those missions, even knowing that many of them probably wouldn't come back. So, but I'd say through the mid-43 through the fall, the odds for both the Americans and the British were almost insurmountable.
Well, listen, we're going to wrap it up right now. You can come back down. But Rich, this is the cherished thing we give the Dr. Harold Deutsch pin set. Thank you for coming up. Wish we could have made weather better. Come down and buy a book from Bob. Express how important the weather forecasting was, and say hi to Rich. And I think we've got a couple.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2 roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.